Good afternoon. Hear me good? Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Contreras, and today I'm going to be talking about my research on pesticide exposure and health risk in Central Valley communities. So before I dig too deep into it, I want to start off by defining pesticides. And the EPA defines pesticides as chemical substances used to prevent, destroy, repel, or mitigate various pests. There are different types of pesticides, which include fungicides, insecticides, and herbicides. So, fungicides are those pesticides or chemical substances which target fungi. Insecticides are those that target insects, and herbicides are those that target various weeds and other types of plants that farmers or growers may not want around their crops. They all have fairly simple names, but aside from targeting pests or mitigating pests, pesticides also have other roles. Farmers use pesticides as plant growth regulators, and basically what that does is farmers can use pesticides to speed up the process or delay the process of growth. They can use pesticides to alter natural growth processes in plants and just things to make harvesting their crops easier. They also use pesticides as defoliants, which basically means they'll use pesticides to force the leaves to fall off of the plants. For instance, farmers will use pesticides on tomato crops to make the leaves fall off so pickers can see the tomatoes easier, which makes the harvesting process a lot more efficient and smooth. Um, they also use pesticides as desiccants. So what that means is they'll use pesticides to kind of dry out the crops, which will make sure that all the crops are ready for this at the same time for harvesting. So they make harvesting a lot more efficient. Um, so pesticides help protect crops and increase yield. They serve, you can see how important they are as they ensure that pests don't destroy crops and they're able to boost the overall production of these crops. And obviously, this is great for farmers as the more crops they have to sell, the bigger profits they should see. But this is actually really good for consumers as well, as the more supply there is of these crops and of this food, then the less we have to pay for it, which is good for us, good for our wallets for sure. But this also helps the global food supply as farmers are able to get this food to different markets across the globe. Some places don't have the capacity to grow as much as we do here, and some places just have to deal with other things like famine and droughts and stuff that affect their food supply. So, do you see the importance that pesticides have on the food production? And it's no wonder that in 2017, the EPA estimated that the annual usage of pesticides in America exceeds 1 billion pounds, which is a staggering number for sure. But as I explained, they do have some benefits. So it's not like they're using them for nothing. However, that should be somewhat concerning to you guys. As some of these pesticides are known to be harmful to human health and the environment. As I mentioned, pesticides play an important role in agricultural production. That's the same here in California, as California is the top agricultural producer in the United States with over $59 billion in cash receipts in agricultural commodities for 2023. And in 2022, there was over 181 million pounds of pesticides applied in California. So it goes to show that though California is really successful in producing agricultural products, this kind of highlights the fact that there's a lot of input required to achieve such high numbers of output. And narrowing that down even further, the Central Valley is the powerhouse of the state's agricultural production. It's home to the most productive soil, most productive region agriculturally here in America. That's evident when looking at the California Department of Food and Agriculture, or the CDFA, as their most recent statistics show that 7 out of the top 10 agricultural producing counties are located within the Central Valley. The top 3 agricultural producing counties being Tulare, Fresno, and Kern County are all located within the Central Valley and had a combined market value of over $24 billion, which is staggering as you consider the overall in California was 59. So those 3 counties alone make up a little over 40% of the total market value of California. Again, though, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of chemical inputs required to achieve such high quantities of food. And it should be no secret then that those 3 counties are also the top users of pesticides in California, with Fresno County using over 26 million pounds of pesticides in 2022, Kern County using over 25 million pesticides in 2022, and Tulare County using over 17 million pounds of pesticides in 2022. Again, highlights the tremendous amount of inputs required to achieve such feats. And as I mentioned earlier, that should be a cause for concern, as multiple studies have previously linked the pesticide usage or usage of certain types of pesticides with adverse human health outcomes, including cancer. So a study by Poe and others, Patak and others, and Pelix and Pelletier have shown that certain pesticides have been linked to certain forms of cancer. These forms of cancer include acute myeloid leukemia, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and brain and other nervous system cancers. These are the ones I decided to focus on at least. There have been other connections, but I found these to be the most interesting, I guess. Aside from cancer, though, pesticides have been linked to other adverse human health effects. Among these are Parkinson's and renal disease. A 2024 study conducted by Kimberly Paul and others highlighted the connection between uses of paraquat, commonly used pesticide here in Kern County for sure, and increased rates of Parkinson's disease, which I found to be very shocking. And a study by Lebov and others have linked pesticide exposure to increased chances of adverse renal disease. Another cause for concern is the effect that pesticides have on the environment, and that's because pesticides don't stay where they're sprayed. A study by Pimentel and Levitin has shown that 99% of the pesticides sprayed do not reach the target pest, which is concerning, because most of that ends up in the environment, in the surrounding environment and communities that surround the application zones and the fields. And this transmission happens in various different ways. For instance, drift is one of the ways that pesticides make their way into the environment. And that basically happens when someone's spraying pesticides, and let's say a gust of wind comes by and it blows those pesticides off of the target or the intended target and into the environment and potentially into neighboring communities. There's also runoff, which happens when pesticides are applied and let's say we get a storm or they're irrigating the pesticides and that kind of washes off into natural like rivers or streams. It could even wash into like underground basins, which affect communities' water wells and stuff like that. Leaching is another issue, and that's when pesticides soak into the ground and make their way into they can make their way into underground basins, which it's really not much you could do after that. We don't have technology to go in there and be able to clean up these chemicals and fix this issue. So that also affects surrounding communities, as a lot of surrounding communities um, rely on underground basins for their water needs, whether that be for cooking, cleaning, showering, or just drinking. Once that's contaminated, it's hard to deal with, and it poses great danger to the communities. And another way is pesticide volatilization, which basically is when pesticides vaporize. And that is a trend that's increasing even more as the climate gets warmer. The vaporization rate increases. So farmers and pesticide appliers, to reach like the similar goals or similar rates of application to have the same effect, they're going to need to start spraying more because it vaporizes at a faster rate due to the increased heat, which just kind of exacerbates the whole issue because now they're having to spray more pesticides to reach the similar outcomes to what they've been trying to get before. And it just kind of makes everything worse. And again, pesticides end up in the environment, they end up in the air you breathe, they end up in surrounding communities, which is concerning. And obviously, this can negatively impact surrounding communities. So this kind of led me to my research question, which was, do agriculturally productive counties like Kern, Tulare, and Fresno, which use more pesticides, experience higher rates of adverse health outcomes when compared to less productive counties like LA, San Francisco, or San Diego? Initially, I would think yes, right? The health outcomes I analyzed include renal disease, more specifically nephritis, nephrotic syndrome, and nephrosis, Parkinson's disease, acute myeloid leukemia, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and brain and other nervous system cancers. Data was gathered from Tracking California, as Tracking California had a lot of like the pesticide rates and usage rates by county, so it made it a lot easier to just gather this information. I also gathered data from the California Cancer Registry, California Department of Public Health, and California Department of Finance. So the California Cancer Registry, I was able to get information and data on the rates of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, acute myeloid leukemia, and brain and other nervous system cancers. I was able to gather that data by county, by year, and the California Department of Public Health was where I gathered data from to analyze the death rates of those renal diseases, and Parkinson's disease. But because they had like raw numbers instead of like an actual rate, I had to get population data from the California Department of Finance, which uses census information and other sources to kind of like estimate the population data. And by using that, I was able to get a rate of per 100,000 to kind of make this accurate. Obviously, places like San Francisco or San Diego have higher population, so they would obviously likely have higher numbers of Parkinson's death and renal disease. So to make it even and standardized, I just did per 100,000, as that would be a lot more accurate than just raw numbers. And once I had this data, I ran a Pearson correlation test to examine the relationship between pesticide usage rates by pounds per acre and health outcome rates per 100,000 people. And as I mentioned, or I might have mentioned, the data was from 1991 all the way through 2018. I felt like this gave me a good time frame of, it was a lot of data, but it gave me a good idea of like the trends in pesticide usage and in the health outcomes. And these tests were conducted twice, once with data from San Francisco and once without. And the reason for this is because San Francisco is pretty unique. For one, it did offer a good example of a highly urbanized county which didn't rely so much on pesticides. However, they had basically no pesticide usage since 1991. I think overall it was like 5 pounds total of like carcinogens and cholinesterase inhibitors, which is really what I was looking at based on previous research. So I didn't want this to skew the data because, I mean, obviously, if they had renal disease or Parkinson's deaths already in there and they didn't have any pesticide usage, then that would skew the data a bit. So I thought it would be best to run the test twice just to kind of be sure that it wasn't influencing my study too much. And what we found, as I mentioned, I tested carcinogens and cholinesterase inhibitors against NEP deaths, Parkinson's death, rates for acute myeloid leukemia, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and brain and other nervous system cancers. And what we found was, or what I found was, there was no strong correlation between any of these, which was shocking to me because, as I mentioned, based on the previous studies and the research I had done, where they talked about the fact that pesticide usage and specifically carcinogens and cholinesterase inhibitors should have led to higher rates of these issues. The findings show that that wasn't the case. The strongest relationship was between carcinogens and NEP deaths with an R value of 0.31. That was with San Francisco. Without San Francisco, it was 0.36, which is still only a moderate positive relationship. You can see here the outcomes. So we have the carcinogens and NEP death rate being a moderate positive correlation, but everything else was like either weak or very weak. So it was inconclusive. I couldn't really say whether they were like actually influencing these health outcomes, which, as I mentioned earlier, was kind of not what I was expecting. So, yeah, okay. The relationships were weaker than I had expected based off of previous research. But that does not mean that pesticides do not influence adverse health outcomes. It just means that it's a lot harder to pinpoint what's causing these issues. For one, there's other factors at play. For instance, a person's diet, their lifestyles, if they smoke, if they drink, if they do drugs, if they have less access to healthcare, these all have a role on this. They all affect the person's overall health. If they stress a lot, this could all lead to increased rates of disease. So it's harder to just pinpoint one thing. Another thing that kind of threw me off was, although Tulare, Kern, and Fresno were more agriculturally productive and known as being like the ag counties, LA actually had higher usage of carcinogens and cholinesterase inhibitors per acre than either of these counties or any of these counties, which I found shocking because it's kind of like, it made me wonder why LA used such high rates and they still didn't achieve as much as we have here. Obviously, the layout is a bit different. They have a lot larger population than we do here in the Central Valley, but it's just like the risk, comparing the risk and the reward, it doesn't seem like they should be using that much, if you ask me. But I was not expecting them to use higher rates of carcinogens and cholinesterase inhibitors than these more agriculturally productive counties. And another thing that I found was that there were still more NEP death rates, or higher NEP is the renal disease death rates in Kern and Tulare counties, which I feel like warrants further investigation as to why that is. I don't know why that is. But yeah, I think somebody should look into that some more. And you see here the carcinogen use per acre, the carcinogen pounds per acre use by county. And this green one here, this is LA County. As you can see, the other 5 counties, Kern, LA, San Diego, San Francisco, or Fresno, Kern, San Diego, San Francisco, and Tulare, they all average under 10 pounds of carcinogens per acre. You compare that here to LA County, which peaked at, I want to say, 116.3 pounds per acre. It was quite shocking. Again, I don't know why they use so much carcinogens, and I did not expect to find that, especially since they're not known as an agricultural county. I mean, I think they're more known for like Hollywood and other stuff like that. Yeah, this was a shock to me. And as I mentioned, they were also one of the highest cholinesterase inhibitor user when it came to like pounds per acre. You see here, I think they peaked at 53 pounds of cholinesterase inhibitors per acre, which was again shocking. You see the rest of the counties. I think Kern County was the second highest at around 10 pounds per acre. Pretty steady around there, while these other counties were around 5, under 10 for sure. But again, it just was shocking to me to see that this was the case. And I do think it kind of like messed with the data a bit. So it's interesting to see. And then here, I know it's a bit jumbled, but we have the annual NEP death rates per 100,000 by county. And you see Tulare County here, it's around 16 NEP death rates, or renal disease death rates per 100,000. And then it kind of cools off, simmers down a bit, which is good to know. But you see Kern County here starts to peak at around 15, closer to 2017, 2018, while the other ones pretty steady around like between 6 and 12. So it's just very interesting. I think someone should take a closer look at this, try to investigate why that is, why there's higher rates of NEP. I keep calling it NEP, but it's nephrosis, nephrotic syndrome, and yeah, the other one. But so that leads me into future research, what I think should be done. And I think future research should seek to expand the scope of the study. So here I just did 6 counties because I thought that's what was feasible for this study. But I think if people have time, they should expand the scope to include maybe like the top 10 counties, or even like the top 10 compared to like the least productive, the least 10 productive counties in California. Ideally, you'd be able to test the whole state and see where these pockets of concentration are for these diseases, and if they correlate with increased uses of pesticides. I also think that future research should also seek to gather comprehensive data on subjects. I just had like pretty plain data. It was by county. But if I had data that was more specific to like where these subjects with, or where these people who had these diseases or who had died from these diseases, if I knew where they lived and how close that was to like application zones and how long they had lived there, and it would kind of show me, it would paint a better picture, as I'd be able to better assess their exposure rate, how long they've been exposed to these pesticides, what kinds of pesticides they've been exposed to, and I'd be able to compare that with their health. If they lived closer to these application zones, and if a group of people lives closer to the application zone and they're all getting cancer, then you can kind of point your finger at that and say, well, maybe it's this here. But because it's just county-wide and it doesn't specify where these people exactly live, they could have lived inner city, just still part of the county, and still had these health outcomes. But yeah, I think future research should seek to have more comprehensive data on that. And these are my references.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I'm also shocked to see there's no correlation, but maybe, as you say, when you look into the more details, you might find one. I was just wondering, maybe you haven't looked at it, maybe the data are not that specific, but for LA, you said that there were more carcinogens used. Do you think there might be a relationship between the types of pesticide used and the crops that they typically produce in those counties? Like which pesticides are linked to the use on what crops? And maybe there's a difference between what they grow over there and they grow over here?
Yeah, certainly. I do remember seeing, like, during my research, they have a pesticide by commodity. So, I mean, certain pesticides are used more so with certain types of crops. It's just the list is expansive. So it's hard to, like, point it to, like, one pesticide use, but definitely there are different pesticides used, which could affect, like, different rates of adverse health outcomes.
Yeah, that would be interesting. And I also have a second one, maybe something that came to mind. You say like there's more like kidney diseases, that's related to kidney diseases here in the valley, right? Kern County, Tulare. You mentioned, and it was just something that popped in my head is that like diabetes also usually affects kidneys. And as we heard this morning about the food swamps, I think, with all the highly processed food, if there could be like not many pesticides leading to the deaths of those, but also like, you know, different types of food, obesity, and then those that, you know, maybe you don't find a correlation between the fungicides and those deaths, but maybe because people here, you know, highly processed foods are often, for whatever weird reason, cheaper than fresh food. And so since we have poverty here, maybe people eat less well, and then therefore get diabetes, and that leads to those deaths. So that might explain why you have opposite correlation or whatever you showed. So it's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I do agree. I think I mentioned that like lifestyle factors definitely play a role in these, and it is that part of the difficulty in assessing like if these pesticides are truly what's causing this, because it's easy to say, well, yeah, pesticides are causing this, but have you seen the way this guy eats? Like, the guy's eating nothing but McDonald's all day, and like that also would like affect your health. So I definitely agree. I do think like diabetes, the higher diabetes rates will most likely lead to like kidney issues. But yeah, I still think it's worth looking into to see like if there is something there, and yeah, of course.
Other questions, comments? Yes.
First, great presentation. What would you want? So my first question would be, what would you want people to take away from your presentation? And then secondly, just as a comment, and you're a political science major, right?
Yes, correct.
I would really encourage you to also maybe provide context on the policy background, particularly in California, with regards to pesticide regulation. That would really help out contextually, historically, what's going on in California and its use of pesticides. But again, the question is, what would you want people to mainly take away?
Pretty much, I would just like a better understanding of these pesticides. I didn't really know about pesticides until I took like a food policy class, and I realized like, oh dang, like I realized the input that was needed to produce such vast quantities of food. And it's something nobody really ever thinks about. At least I didn't really think about. Like when I go to the grocery store, I'm just used to seeing all these fruits and vegetables there. I don't think about what it takes to make these foods or what it takes to get that food there. So I think having a better understanding of the process of actually like what goes into making that, putting that on the table would help people like understand more, kind of have them more willing to like engage in like, okay, maybe we don't want these chemicals sprayed on our food, or maybe at least know which chemicals are being sprayed and like what the potential health effects are of that. And to your second point, I initially had like a whole section on like it was basically the inadequacy with the pesticide regulation. And it was talking about how like here in the US, there's like multiple pesticides that we still allow to be used when in other agriculturally dominant countries like Brazil, China, India, I don't remember the full list, but these pesticides are banned, and it's because there's known health, like adverse health effects, and these countries, their governments have stepped in and said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to risk it. But here, again, like it's a lot of times profits get prioritized. And that's another reason I think people should know about this, is because when you do know that like it takes chemicals and a bunch of like a combination of chemicals to get this banana onto your, you know, like into your smoothie or whatever, like maybe you'll think twice about like, do I really want this? Or maybe I should like, I don't know, seek some type of change in that system.
Any other questions? Okay, great. Thank you, Stephen.
Or-